I did it because he was my son. That's the only reason I ever needed, and for 2 years, it was enough. My knees have been bad since I turned 60. The right one especially, it pops when I climb stairs, aches when the weather changes, reminds me every morning that I am not the man I used to be. I was 64 years old, 3 years out of the job I'd held for 31 years, and I was alone in the house my wife and I had bought together back when Ronald Reagan was still president. She passed in 2019. Breast cancer. We had 2 sons. The older one lives out in Phoenix with his family, calls every Sunday, sends Christmas cards. The younger one, Daniel, was the one who worried me his whole life, and somehow also the one I loved with a ferocity that still embarrasses me to admit. Daniel was 38 when he died. That's what they told me. That's what I believed for a very long time. He and his wife had taken their boat out on a Saturday in early October. The kind of October day that tricks you: bright sky, cool air, the lake flat as glass when you leave the dock, but capable of turning ugly by afternoon. They were maybe 2 miles out when the weather shifted. His wife made it back. Daniel did not. The search went on for 4 days. They found the boat capsized, found one of his shoes caught on a rock near the eastern shore. They never found him. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room while my daughter-in-law was being treated for hypothermia. I remember a young deputy sheriff sitting across from me and speaking very gently, telling me that given the water temperature and the current patterns and the time elapsed, the likelihood of recovery was low. I remember nodding as if I understood what he was saying. I didn't understand anything. My brain had simply stopped accepting new information. We held a memorial service 11 days later. Closed casket, obviously. 112 people came. I counted them because I didn't know what else to do with my hands and my eyes. My daughter-in-law stood beside me at the front of the room and cried in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine, and I put my arm around her and told her we were going to be okay. My grandson Lucas was 7 years old. He kept asking where his dad was, and we kept telling him that his dad had gone somewhere very far away, but that he loved him very much. Lucas seemed to accept this, the way children accept things they don't fully understand, quietly, with a kind of gravity that breaks your heart. The month after the memorial, I started sending my daughter-in-law $2,000. She hadn't asked. I just did it. She had Lucas. She had a mortgage on a house that Daniel had stretched too far to buy, and she had a part-time job at a dental office that paid her maybe $14 an hour. The math was simple. I was a retired principal. I had a pension and my wife's life insurance and a paid-off house. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't struggling. My son was gone, and his family needed help, and I was his father. It was not a complicated decision. I drove over every Sunday. I'd bring groceries, nothing elaborate, just the things I knew they needed, milk and bread and whatever fruit Lucas was eating that month, which changed constantly because he was 8, and then 9, and opinions shift. I'd sit with Lucas while he did his homework. I helped him build a model of the solar system for a school project. I fixed the screen door that had been sticking since the previous summer. I mowed the lawn in warm weather. I was trying to be useful, because usefulness was the only language I had left for love. My daughter-in-law was always grateful. Warmly, genuinely grateful. I believed that then, and I believe it now. She would thank me when I arrived with the groceries, would tell me I didn't have to do so much, that she didn't want me to overextend myself. I always told her that Daniel would have wanted this. She would go quiet when I said that, and I thought it was grief. I understand now that it was something else. The Sundays had a rhythm. I'd arrive around noon. She'd offer me coffee. I'd sit with Lucas. We'd sometimes eat lunch together. I'd leave by 3 or 4. But there was one thing I noticed, and I noticed it. I just didn't trust what I was noticing, which was that she never once invited me inside without me already being at the threshold. She would open the door before I knocked, almost like she was watching for me, and she would step out onto the porch slightly, and we would do the handoff of groceries right there. It wasn't rude, it wasn't cold, but looking back, the door to her house was never fully open to me. I thought it was her way of maintaining some private space in her grief. I respected it. I was wrong to. 14 months after Daniel died, I ran into my old friend from the school district at the hardware store. We'd worked together for over 20 years. He taught shop class and coached the wrestling team, and we'd had lunch together almost every Friday for the better part of 2 decades. When my wife got sick, he was the one who quietly rearranged his schedule to cover for me on the days I needed to be at the hospital. Good man. Solid man. The kind of man you don't fully appreciate until you need him. We stood in the lumber aisle and talked for maybe 20 minutes. He asked about my daughter-in-law and Lucas, and I told him they were managing. He nodded, but something in his expression shifted in a way I couldn't read. He asked where she was living now, and I told him she was still in the house on Birchwood Drive, and he nodded again in that same careful way, and then he looked at me and said, "How often do you go over there?" I told him Sundays, usually around noon. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have you ever driven by there on a weeknight? Say, Thursday or Friday after dark?" I told him no. I told him I tried not to intrude on her time. He picked up a box of screws, turned it over in his hands, set it back down. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said. "You're a grown man, and you know your own family better than I do. But I would take a drive past that house one night this week. That's all I'm going to say." I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. "I'm probably wrong. I hope I am. Just take a drive." I drove home, and I set the hardware store bag on my kitchen table, and I stood there for a long time. My old friend was not a man who stirred things up without reason. He was not dramatic. He did not involve himself in other people's business as a rule. If he was telling me to drive past my daughter-in-law's house, he had a reason. I told myself I wasn't going to do it. I made dinner, watched the news, went to bed. I lay there for 2 hours in the dark, staring at the ceiling and not sleeping. And at 11:15 I got up, put on my jacket, and drove to Birchwood Drive. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. A dark blue sedan, relatively new, parked where my daughter-in-law's car usually sat. Her car was pushed to the side, half on the grass. The lights inside the house were on the living room, the kitchen at the back. I sat at the end of the street for a few minutes. Nothing happened. A light went off in the kitchen. I drove home. I told myself there were 100 explanations. A brother visiting, a friend, a new boyfriend, which she had every right to have. I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself this for 4 days, and then on Thursday I drove back. The same blue sedan was there. This time I parked farther down the block, behind a truck, where I could see the driveway without being obvious about it. I don't know what I expected. I sat there for 40 minutes, watching a house with its lights on, feeling like a fool, and I was about to leave when the front door opened. 2 people came out onto the porch. My daughter-in-law and a man. They were laughing about something. I could see it in their body language even from that distance. She had her hand on his arm. He turned to say something to her, and I saw his profile in the porch light. I stopped breathing. It wasn't the face. The distance was too great and the light was too weak for me to see a face clearly. It was the way he moved. He shifted his weight to his left side when he laughed. A slight lean that came from an old sports injury to his right hip that Daniel had carried since he was 16. His hands went into his jacket pockets as he turned back toward the steps. My son had walked that way his entire adult life. I used to tease him about it. I used to say he walked like he was always leaning into a headwind. I had watched that walk for 38 years. The man went down the porch steps and got into the blue sedan and drove away. I sat in my car and could not move. My hands were on the wheel and my hands were shaking, and I could hear my own breathing very loudly in the small space of the car. I stayed there for I don't know how long. Long enough for all the lights in the house to go off. Long enough for the street to be completely quiet. I drove home, and I did not sleep at all that night. The next morning I called my old friend. I told him what I'd seen. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was sorry, and then he told me what he knew. He had been visiting his sister in a town about 40 miles north of us. He had stopped at a diner for breakfast, and he had seen, sitting at a corner table with a woman he didn't recognize, a man who looked so much like my son that he'd almost called out his name before he caught himself. He'd watched the man for several minutes. The lean, the hands in the pockets when he stood up, the way he tilted his head when he was listening. He'd followed them to the parking lot and gotten a partial plate number. "I didn't know if I should tell you," he said. I didn't know if I was just seeing what I wanted to see. I thought maybe I missed him too. You weren't seeing things, I told him. I want to be careful about what I say next, because it would be easy to describe what I did as the actions of a man who immediately knew what he was going to do. That would be a lie. The truth is that I spent 3 days in a state of complete disorientation. I would pick up the phone to call my daughter-in-law and put it back down. I would get in the car and then get out of the car and go back inside. I was 64 years old. My son was dead. I had arranged his memorial. I had put my arm around his wife while she wept. I had helped his son understand that his father was gone. And now I was being asked to consider the possibility that none of it had been real. I called my older son in Phoenix. I told him I needed to talk. I didn't tell him everything. Just enough that I had seen something that was bothering me and that I needed help thinking it through. He listened, and when I'd finished, he said what I had expected him to say, which was that grief does things to people and that maybe I should talk to someone. I didn't argue with him. I said I would think about it, but I knew what I had seen. And my older son had not spent 38 years watching Daniel walk across a room. On the 4th day, I hired a private investigator. I found her through a referral from an attorney I knew from the school board. She was in her late 40s, had previously worked in insurance fraud, and she had an expression that conveyed she had heard everything and was surprised by nothing. I gave her the partial plate number my old friend had written down. I told her I needed to know who was driving that car. She called me 8 days later. The car was registered to a name I didn't know, but the address associated with that name was a short-term rental in a small town about 45 miles north. She had done some additional digging. Small. RS. The name was an alias with a paper trail that didn't hold up past 18 months ago, around the time of the boat accident. She sent me a photograph. It was taken from a distance, through a windshield, not very high quality. A man walking out of a grocery store, head slightly down, hands in his jacket pockets, weight shifted to his left side. It was my son. It was Daniel. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with that photograph on my phone. My coffee went cold. The morning light moved across the floor. My son was alive. My son had staged his own death, had let me grieve him, had watched me send his wife $2,000 a month for 26 months, had been 30 miles away this entire time living under a false name, $72,000. That's the math. 26 months at $2,000 a month, plus the groceries, plus the repairs, plus the life insurance policy that my daughter-in-law had collected. I didn't know the exact amount, but I knew the policy existed because Daniel had mentioned it once, years ago, in the context of responsible adult things he had finally done. I later learned it was $180,000. I was not a violent man, and I was not going to be one now. But I was a precise man. I had spent 31 years as an educator and an administrator, which meant I understood documentation, and I understood process. Before I did anything else, I called the attorney who had referred me to the investigator. I told him what I had found. He told me what I suspected, which was that this constituted insurance fraud, and that there were proper channels, and that I should think carefully before acting unilaterally. I thought carefully. For about 12 hours. Then I drove to Birchwood Drive on a Sunday morning, at the usual time, with the usual groceries, as if nothing had changed. My daughter-in-law opened the door before I knocked, the way she always did. She was wearing a blue sweater, and her hair was pulled back, and she smiled at me and said good morning and reached for one of the bags. Lucas was somewhere inside. I could hear the television. I handed her the bag. I looked at her. I said, "How is Daniel?" Her face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It didn't collapse. It didn't go pale. It did something more complicated than either of those things, a kind of rapid recalculation, a split second of terrible arithmetic. And then she tried to reassemble the smile. But the smile was wrong now. The smile was the thing that confirmed everything. "I don't understand," she said. "I think you do," I said. Lucas appeared in the hallway behind her. She turned instinctively and said, "Baby, go back and watch your show for a little while, okay?" And he went. Because he was 9, and he trusted adults. And that trust was one more thing that Daniel had taken for granted. She stepped outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. We stood on the porch in the October cold, and she looked at the grocery bag in her hands, and she started to cry. Not the performance I had seen at the memorial. This was different. This was a person who had been holding something for 2 years and had just been told she could put it down. She told me everything. I'm not going to recount all of it because some of it is her story and her shame and her attempt, eventually, to do the right thing when the right thing was still available to her. The broad shape of it was this. Daniel had gotten into serious debt. Not ordinary debt. Debt connected to people who did not operate through courts or collections agencies. He had been terrified. He had come to her with a plan that she had initially refused and then, in her fear for him and for herself and for Lucas, had agreed to. The plan was his. The contacts who had helped him disappear were his. She had played the grieving widow and had intended to keep playing it, she said, until Lucas was grown and they could find a way to bring Daniel back under a new identity or, failing that, until she could stop. Did you plan to stop sending me money? I asked her. She couldn't look at me. He said we'd tell you eventually. When it was safe. When it was safe, I repeated. She was still crying. But I noticed that I was not. I was standing on that porch in the cold morning, feeling something that I could not name then and that I would not call grief exactly, although it was in the same family. It was the feeling of looking at something you built over a lifetime. Your belief in a person, your love for them, the specific shape of who you understood them to be, and seeing that it had been built on something you didn't know, was hollow. I need you to call him, I said. I need you to tell him to come here. She said she was scared. I told her that I understood she was scared, and that what happened next was going to be difficult, and that if she cooperated fully and immediately, I believed the outcome for her would be significantly better than if she did not. I was not threatening her. I was a retired principal. I was telling her the practical truth about consequences, the same way I had told it to students and parents for 3 decades. She heard it the way people hear truth when they've been waiting for it with a kind of exhausted relief. She made the call while I stood beside her. I don't know what she said exactly. Her voice was very quiet. She told him he needed to come, that it was about Lucas, that it was urgent. I heard his voice through the phone, tinny and distant, asking questions. She answered them quietly. She hung up. He'll be here in an hour, she said. I went inside and sat with Lucas while we waited. He showed me a drawing he'd done of a spaceship. I told him it was excellent engineering. He told me it could go faster than light if it had the right fuel. And I asked him what the right fuel was, and he said he was still working on that part. He leaned against my arm while we talked, the way he had since he was small. And I kept my hand very steady. My son arrived in 53 minutes. I watched through the living room window as the blue sedan pulled into the driveway. He sat in the car for a moment. Then, he got out. I met him at the door. I don't know what he expected to see. Not me. His face went through several things in rapid succession: shock, and then something that might have been relief, and then a desperate recalibration, and then, finally, something that looked like a man who is very tired and has been carrying something very heavy and has just set it down on the ground at his father's feet. He said, "Dad." I said, "Come inside." We sat at the kitchen table. His wife took Lucas upstairs. The 3 of us were alone in the kitchen in the house that my monthly checks had helped pay for, and I looked at my son, this man I had raised and taught to ride a bicycle and watched graduate and carried in my grief for 26 months. And I said what I had been composing for 3 days. I told him I knew everything. I told him what I had spent. I told him about the investigator and what she had found. I told him that I had already spoken with an attorney and that within 24 hours I intended to report what I knew to the appropriate authorities, which would include the insurance company that had paid out $180,000 on the assumption that he was dead. He tried, once, to explain. He told me about the debt, about the fear, about how he'd had no other option. I listened to all of it. When he was finished, I said, "You had other options. You chose not to take them because the other options were hard, and this one made you disappear." He looked at the table. "You let me grieve you," I said. You let your son think his father was dead. You let me stand in a funeral home and tell 100 people that we had to find a way to go on. You took my money every month for over 2 years. He didn't say anything. I told him what was going to happen. He was going to surrender himself. His wife was going to cooperate fully. The money mine and the insurance companies was going to be addressed through whatever legal process followed. I had already been told by the attorney that voluntary surrender and cooperation would be considered in sentencing. I told him I was not doing this out of anger. Although I was angry, I was doing it because his son was upstairs, and his son deserved to grow up knowing that his father was a real person who made real decisions and faced real consequences, and not a ghost or a lie, or a story his mother told him at bedtime. He started crying at some point. I let him. I had cried for him for 26 months, and I had nothing left to give in that direction. We talked for a long time. By the end of it, he had agreed to everything. I don't say this to paint myself as a man who commands rooms. I think he had been waiting for someone to tell him it was over. I think the weight of what he had done had become something he couldn't manage anymore. I think he had loved me once, in the incomplete and self-centered way that some people are capable of loving, and that being looked at by his father and told the specific shape of what he had done was, in its way, a mercy that he had needed. The legal process that followed is not something I am going to describe in detail because it is still in some portions unresolved, and because it involved my daughter-in-law and my grandson, in ways that are theirs to navigate. What I will say is that my daughter-in-law cooperated as I had asked her to. What I will say is that the insurance company recovered what it could, and that my son entered a guilty plea that included restitution. What I will say is that Lucas was told by his mother, carefully and age-appropriately, that his father was not dead, that his father had made very serious mistakes, and that the situation was being sorted out by the adults who loved him. Lucas, who was 9 years old and smarter than most adults I have known, asked 2 questions. The first was whether his father had wanted to leave him. His mother said no, and I believe that part of it was true. The second was whether he was going to be okay. His mother told him yes. I told him yes. I don't tell children things I don't intend to make true. I still go to Birchwood Drive on Sundays. I stopped sending the checks, and not because I didn't want to help Lucas. I did, and I found other ways to make sure he had what he needed, ways that went directly to him, rather than through a household that had turned out to contain a great deal I hadn't understood. I still bring groceries sometimes, though now I am always invited inside, and my daughter-in-law makes coffee and we sit at the kitchen table like 2 people who have survived something difficult together, which is what we are. Lucas is doing well in school. He has moved on from spaceships to astronomy, the real kind, with telescopes and star charts. I bought him a decent beginner's telescope for his birthday, and we set it up in the backyard on a Friday night and found Saturn, and he made a sound when he saw the rings that I will keep for the rest of my life. He asked me once, a few months after everything came out, if I was sad about his dad. I thought about it for a minute. I told him I was sad about some things and glad about other things, and that most of the time those 2 feelings could live in the same place if you gave them enough room. He thought about this seriously. The way he thinks about most things. That makes sense, he said. My knees still ache. The right one especially, still pops on the stairs, still tells me when rain is coming. I am 65 now, and I live alone in the house where I raised 2 sons, and I think about the version of myself who stood in a funeral home 2 years ago and wept for a man who was 40 miles away and very much alive. I think about the Sunday mornings I drove to Birchwood Drive with my groceries, the door that opened before I knocked, the porch where I was always received but never fully invited in. I don't think about it with bitterness, exactly. I think about it the way you think about a road you traveled that turned out to go somewhere you didn't intend, with a certain bewilderment, and a note to yourself about paying closer attention to the signs. My old friend from the hardware store, the one who told me to take a drive one night, I had him over for dinner last week. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about old colleagues and old students and what had happened to this one and that one. At the end of the night, when he was putting on his coat at the door, I told him that I didn't know how to thank him for what he'd done. He waved it off, the way he always waves things off. He said he'd done nothing, just mentioned a thing. I said it was more than that. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment. "You did the hard part," he said. "You always do." I locked the door after he left and stood in my front hallway in the quiet house. Through the window at the top of the stairs, I could see a piece of the night sky, cold and clear, the way October skies get when the weather finally turns. Somewhere out there, 45 miles north, my son was facing the consequences of a decision he had made when he was afraid and out of options, or told himself he was out of options, which is not the same thing. Somewhere 9 miles east, my grandson was asleep in his room with a star chart on his desk and a telescope in his backyard, and a future that was going to be complicated and also, I believed, fundamentally okay. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. My right knee ached a little. The forecast said rain by morning. I have learned, at 65, that most things you do for people out of love are not lost, even when they are taken advantage of. They go somewhere. They accumulate. They come back to you in forms you didn't expect and couldn't have planned for, in a boy who leans against your arm when he talks to you, in a Friday night with Saturn in a telescope lens, in an old friend who tells you one small thing and trusts you to do the rest. I did it because he was my son. I would do it again. Not all of it. Not the parts I did in the dark. Sending money to a woman who was keeping a secret that was eating her alive. Telling myself the closed door was grief. But the loving him, yes. The showing up every Sunday, yes. The sitting at that table in the cold truth of what he had done and still looking him in the face and telling him what came next, yes, that too. You don't stop being a father because someone makes it hard. You just get better at knowing what fatherhood actually requires.